Well, joining us on the show today is Chris Osborne. He's the president of Warrior Maven and also at the Center for Military Modernization. Chris, we spoke with you, I think it was a few years back, to talk about hypersonic missiles, and we've also talked about a number of things that are happening on the cutting edge of AI intelligence, warfare, and the like. There's been a lot of information coming out more recently, I would say over the past couple months, starting really last year, about how the military is now fast tracking
Yeah.
AI into all aspects of warfare. I know you've done some fascinating interviews, written articles about this. Can you tell us about what we're seeing on your end?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure to talk to you again. And it's tough to underestimate the importance of AI in terms of, as you said, how it's being fast tracked by the Pentagon. There are so many applications as well as so many challenges and ways to try and further solidify the reliability of AI so that it can be more effective in a tactical environment and of course more reliable. There are so many different things to consider in terms of drones, autonomy, unmanned systems. There are even systems like the Air Force's Golden Horde where munitions are sharing information with one another while in flight. They call it collaborative messaging. And essentially the big move forward in terms of a purely technical sense is AI at the point of collection, so that you don't necessarily have a central database or a hub that's ground based or a command and control center, but something that's happening with a smaller form factor in a forward tactical environment. So what you have is massively increased efficiency. The idea is to increase efficiency, and in terms of offensive or combined arms maneuver and traditional combat tactics and strategies, the idea is to truncate or shorten sensor to shooter time. What used to take 20 minutes in terms of identifying a target, verifying something, sending it through the chain of command, having a decision. So, in terms of the speed of warfare and information being driven as the primary margin of difference in terms of who might prevail in a conflict, the idea of sensor to shooter time cannot be underestimated, especially when it comes to collection and analysis at the point of collection further out, whether it's a drone, a fighter jet, or a manned ground vehicle. So those are a couple of quick things in a general sense. There is a reliability challenge with AI at the moment, but I can go on with whatever else you might be thinking of.
Let's dive into some specific examples, just so that we can kind of wrap our minds around what we're looking at. I think you touched upon a number of different areas at a high level where AI is being integrated. But yeah, if you would mind, give us some specific examples.
Absolutely, Chris. Well, one of the most cutting edge areas and one of the most important areas comes with drone defense and, let's see, drone swarm defense. And AI can save lives in these kinds of scenarios because you have sensors at the point of collection. Essentially, they're able to gather information from otherwise federated or disparate sensor pools, pool them into a central database, analyze them, perform the analytics after collecting or aggregating, and then identify those most relevant moments, those most relevant pieces of information, and transmit them. So there can be sensor to shooter pairing and countermeasure to attacking drone swarm pairing that can happen in milliseconds. For example, if you have a swarm of drones that are approaching, but it's a civilian area, you don't necessarily want a kinetic countermeasure or effector because of additional fragmentation or collateral damage or civilian casualties. So maybe you'll choose a non-kinetic effect or something like EW or microwave or even a laser that's more precise that wouldn't generate as much explosive fragments. Perhaps the weather is cloudy or there are obscurants in the air and a laser wouldn't work because the light signature wouldn't be sufficient to enable a laser weapon. So in many situations, especially if you have a swarm or a drone swarm and so many points of potential contact, the whole point of a swarm is to overwhelm radar and overwhelm, not only blanket an area with surveillance, but essentially make it impossible to defend against due to the massive redundancy, right? The a massive amount of nodes of attack. Well, something like EW might be a better or more appropriate countermeasure or effector in that scenario, as you could blanket an area with an electromagnetic signal to essentially derail or throw a drone off course. One of the most cutting edge areas of AI defense, AI enabled defense with drone defense, is using RF signatures to essentially acquire the protocol of an attacking drone in the air and either throw it off course or actually take it over and land it somewhere else, using AI to discriminate what information that is. And I think the base and what's relevant about that and how that can be taken over in terms of identifying exactly what something is. And that's what AI is able to do. And I think the basic conceptual framework is at times not misunderstood, but not fully recognized in some extent, in some ways. And this is to take incoming new information, bounce it off a vast or seemingly limitless database, and make those determinations in a matter of seconds. And so perhaps there was a historical instance where a certain kind of drone could not be jammed with a certain kind of frequency. Well, that kind of information would be accessible in a vast database that's been data tagged with sufficient contingencies. The biggest challenge with AI is what happens when it comes across something that's not part of its database. To what extent can you have contextual determinations or more subjective analysis? For example, if you have ball is in football, ball is in dance ball, can an AI system discern the difference based on the surrounding words and the context of the sentence? And the answer is increasingly, yeah. And so there's this real push to have more capable AI that can address less precise or more subjective nuances in a way that's extremely effective. You also have ways of protecting AI against countermeasures that are designed to obscure, obfuscate, or cause problems with sensors. But to stick with this one example, drone defense is extremely critical because of the time window and because of the need to pair sensors and shooters. That process, humans can make the decisions and have the analytical cognitive ability and all kinds of other attributes and variables that machines don't have to make certain critical decisions. The process of organizing the information and doing this pairing based on historical precedent, based on available data, is what takes milliseconds now. And that saves lives, which is why there's this discussion about out of the loop AI. Can there be a purely defensive autonomous system, which is an altogether different and significant question? AI has the ability to see a threat, recognize it, bounce it off a database, come up with an optimal countermeasure, and then, if necessary, enable or effect that countermeasure, essentially fire off a group of interceptors to knock out an attacking drone, perhaps take out an incoming mortar or rocket or missile system. Can that happen without a need for human intervention? The answer is yeah. And there's this discussion about out of the loop AI. So, can you save lives by using AI enabled autonomous systems to knock out attacks without necessarily needing a human to say, that's what that is, here's what they need, I authorize the use of this force in this instance? The question then becomes, what if something's manned? Because, of course, Pentagon doctrine is you can't use lethal force without a human decision maker. So that's where the gray area and the conceptual discussion is coming in terms of policy. Is AI reliable enough so that you can make those discernments and essentially save lives by purely defensively oriented autonomy without necessarily making a mistake and shooting down a manned platform without the use of a human decision maker?
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that too is when you're talking about using autonomous systems out of the loop, that is that the entire kill chain is done autonomously without any human agency involved. Yes, we may say we do not want to pursue that, and we want to make sure that there is human decision making in that process. But if your competitor, if your enemy is doing the opposite, and then that ends up speeding up the process, making them more efficient or more competitive on the battlefield, then that puts you at a loss. So that's the interesting thing that we see here is between US and China both racing ahead in integrating AI into all aspects of this.
Well, I'm glad you said that. That was a really important point. And it recalls to mind a conversation I had not long ago with a senior leader at Army Futures Command. And one of the things that point simply, it sounds kind of jazzy or almost pop culture Terminator. The US military is preparing to fight armies of robots. And that's not an exaggeration. And it's exactly as you said, there is this pressing concern about while the US military may have doctrinal and ethical parameters, a potential adversary simply may not. and the ability to operate technology and weapons that can see targets, identify targets, and then shoot or attack those targets without needing human intervention. That ability is essentially here. And so the question then becomes an ethical, philosophical, or conceptual one. And that is a concern. And there certainly is a discrepancy. The US military might not want to have force used without human decision makers. That is the doctrine. And there are ethical reasons for that. And that's an important parameter. That's an important decision. But what happens if, as you say, the attack curve is accelerated so much that you're in peril, you're at risk of being destroyed if you don't do something comparable? And I think that's part of the premise or the input or that's informing this discussion about out of the loop. Are there ways that AI can become reliable enough to operate in a purely defensive manner without using lethal force or using speed, autonomy, and information processing to save lives? And I think as you put your finger right on it, that's the cutting edge of AI right now. And it relates to what we hear in terms of zero trust. And that's the term that so many different defense industry and weapons developers use to refer to ways to making AI more reliable. What happens if AI system comes across something that's not in its database and it does those yay nay algorithms, right? So the question is, what if there's a false positive, or what if it misidentifies something, or what if it simply doesn't understand something? Then you have a matrix of confusing variables that could collide.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about AI is that we see, I mean, it can look at multiple layers of information simultaneously. So, I mean, it makes it very powerful. It's clear. I think anyone who's used any large language model, for example, for their own research purposes, can see just the sophistication of these systems and why, of course, the military is fast tracking the integration of artificial intelligence into all aspects of warfare, including the fact that China and many other countries are doing the exact same thing in parallel as well. And I want to go back to a comment that you made, because you said that the US military is literally preparing for an eventual war with robots. Now, we already see autonomous weapon systems in terms of robot dogs that are being used, drones like you gave an example. We see robotic or autonomous tanks. There's autonomous even submarines and underwater vehicles. I mean, so we're seeing a wider and wider range of autonomy. And then we also see this at the level of command and control, military planning as well, at a high level view. And one of the areas that I know in terms of investor interest that's really taking off right now is the improvements that we've seen with humanoid robots. So it's not going to be very long from now. Just like, you and I were talking about the future of warfare years back, some of these things we're seeing now, I think it's only going to be probably a few years before we're going to be talking about humanoid robotic soldiers, on the battlefield carrying packs and engaging the enemy that way. I mean, we're not that far away from that.
Absolutely. I think you put your finger right on it again. I think that's extremely accurate and exactly what the military is looking at. What it reminds me of, and what you said, was a key conceptual and philosophical, almost ethical debate, which is really central to all of this. And a great solution is what the Air Force is doing, which is R2. It's an AI-enabled co-pilot. So you have a manned decision maker flying the jet, flying with a robotic controller or a robotic unmanned AI-enabled co-pilot. And now that really speaks to what the synergy involves, because the prevailing consensus is really what you need is both. You want those variables and attributes that are unique to human cognition. You want those merging with or operating in correspondence in tandem with AI-enabled systems. So you have the processing speed and the computing and the information management that's fundamental to AI that can happen in milliseconds, exponentially faster than human decision making, yet you still retain that implicitly subjective and critically important human ability to perceive and human ability to make decision making. Because, call me a liberal arts guy, I studied a lot of philosophy, but this idea that all kinds of human consciousness can be replicated with computer generated mathematical algorithms doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. What about feeling? What about emotion centers in the brain? What about psychological nuances? What about things like ethics, morality, or fast changing variables in a complex situation? There are certain things which, at least at the moment, it seems to me, computer generated algorithms can't replicate. Arguably, they'd never be able to replicate. You know who said it really well was President Obama. I saw him once on an interview, and he was asked about AI, and he said computers can't feel joy. And that's saying it much better than I ever could. I could give you a speech about a philosopher and consciousness and how the external world is apprehended by the human mind. And it probably wouldn't come close to succinctly talking about what President Obama said. And he sort of exactly defined it. Are there emotion centers in the brain? I've heard that. But perhaps a given leader had a horrible night the night before and was abused or had a traumatic experience and then decided to launch a missile the next day. Can you generate an AI system that can replicate that or somehow anticipate or predict that? You can look at more subjective phenomena, speech patterns, behavior patterns. You can certainly look at a lot of indicators and a lot of factual considerations when it comes to drawing different kinds of analysis. And the cutting edge of AI is looking at more subjective variables, more subjective nuances. And that's really the cutting edge, as you point out. Humanoid robots, to what extent will algorithms enable these robots to make the kinds of determinations that are necessary in lethal combat? And there is a philosophical question here, and that's part of why the optimal approach, and you think about what the Pentagon most likes right now, it's the combination of both. It's R2, it's the AI co-pilot with the man pilot, because you have the best of both working in coordination that you really need, both of them working together. That computing and AI simply can't replace human cognition, and I'm of that view.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to Norbert Wiener at MIT, who invented the field of cybernetics. Of course, you know, he was working on that in the early days. We're seeing the ongoing development of that process, like you're saying, integrating both the control and communication between the machine and the human. And I think, you know, there's two sides to the coin. There's the AI side, which obviously gets a lot of focus, but there's also the other side of the coin, which is the intelligence augmentation, right? So we are seeing the augmentation of human intelligence as well as the integration of AI. So both those things are operating. And I think that this is going to be a developing discussion moving forward in the months and years ahead, of course. So we're going to have to bring you back on to talk about, you know, any of the cutting edge state of the art developments that we are seeing. I know that you write on at your website. So as we close, Chris, would you mind telling our listeners more ways that they can follow your work and keep track of these developments?
Well, that's nice of you to say. Sure, warriormaven.com is a site where we try and get expertise and have expert warrior subscriptions and have leading thinkers, flag officers, military leaders, decision makers basically talk about a number of these variables with respect to, as you pointed to a few times, the current threat environment and the pace of technology. So I appreciate that very much. And viewers and readers are amazing and welcome to join. I'm blown away by the sophistication of our audience. I read comments, I get feedback, and I hear from people who have an expertise that is really impressive. So I encourage anyone who follows these issues, take a look, check us out, and send me some ideas, criticize me, tell me where myself or some of my other experts are off base.
All right, sounds good. And once again, that's warriormaven.com.